Hi, and welcome to the BL Business Branding Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Martinez, and this is my co-host, Isabel Wadsworth. And today we're going to go through a recent trademark infringement lawsuit filed by Ford against a company out of Georgia, Vintage Broncos. And so we're going to talk about some of the allegations in the complaint, some of the defenses, the scope of damages, and then what businesses can take away from this lawsuit.
Yes, so as Nick mentioned, we are diving into a fascinating trademark dispute between Ford Motor Company and Vintage Modern Inc. If you're a fan of classic cars, intellectual property law, or you just love a good classic courtroom showdown, this episode is for you. We are going to dive straight into this fascinating case.
So yeah, going off from the beginning with the basics of the Ford Broncos, my understanding is Ford first produced the Broncos from around 1966 until the mid-90s. And then it wasn't until recently, I think it was 2017 or so, where they announced they were bringing it back.
Right, that's exactly right. So you mentioned taking it back to the 1960s. That's where our story begins here with Ford Motor Company, an automotive giant known by so many people in this country for its legendary Bronco SUVs, first introduced, as you said, in 1966. The Bronco has built a loyal following, cementing itself as an American iconic vehicle. You, Nick, are actually a proud owner of a Ford Bronco.
That is true.
So that's super fun for our discussion today. And as you mentioned, on the other side of this, we do have Vintage Modern Inc., a company specializing in restoring and modernizing the classic Ford Broncos. I think, like you mentioned, they began doing that around the 2019 period. And they pride themselves on having a high-end approach to these refurbishing processes. And Vintage Modern transforms Broncos into luxurious resto mods, as they call them, combining the classic aesthetics as you see on the screen in the bottom right of the Ford Bronco look with the modern technology of what you see in that left corner of the screen with the current model of the Bronco with sort of the standard modern technology you see in a car driving down the street today.
Now, so is Vintage Broncos, are they just an aftermarket shop? Like, do they just go buy a Ford Bronco and just make changes to it?
I mean, essentially, that's what they do. They take the Ford Bronco, they purchase it, and they sort of break it down, for lack of a better word, and put on the aesthetic features of the vintage Bronco. And that's sort of the problem that Ford has with what they're doing. Ford has taken legal action against Vintage Modern, claiming trademark infringement, false advertising, and unfair competition. And Ford is alleging that Vintage Modern has unlawfully used its trademarks through their processes of the refurb because they are including the words Ford and Bronco in marketing and selling their restored vehicles.
Well, so where's the line, right? Like, as a Bronco owner,
right,
if I've made some aftermarket customizations to my car,
right,
am I now not allowed to go sell it?
Well, it's an interesting development in the case because they have two sides of the story, right? Ford's way of telling the story is that using Ford and Bronco names by Vintage Modern could mislead consumers into believing that Vintage Modern's Bronco are officially affiliated with or endorsed by Ford. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. You mentioned, where's the line? It's when there's a risk of consumers being misled by what Ford is endorsing when in fact they are not endorsing what Vintage Modern is doing. Mm. And Ford is further claiming that Vintage Modern's marketing materials, so not just the look, but how they're marketing the product, including social media posts and advertisements, prominently feature Ford's branding and the Bronco name. So they're not just, using it on their products, but they're advertising as if, the Ford folks are endorsing what they're doing.
Yeah, where I think if you look at the screen now, we have the Ford logo on top and then the Vintage Bronco down below. Not to use too much legal terminologies, but those do look confusingly similar.
Right.
Where it could get complicated to see which is the real Bronco versus which is maybe Ford just did a special edition of it. I know Ford has their Heritage line where they kind of try to throw back to the old days, or they'll have the two-tone side panels and things like that.
Yes, it's definitely those two marks are similar in some respects, but they're also different in some respects. And Vintage Modern is fighting back on these claims that Ford is making, and in their argument, they deny most of Ford's claims. They argue that they have a legal right to sell restored Ford Broncos, and that their use of the Ford trademark, the Ford Bronco trademark more specifically, falls under fair use and first sale doctrine. So again, you mentioned not to use legal jargon, but for folks who don't know what first sale doctrine is, it very simply put is a doctrine that states once a company sells a product, so for example, once Ford sells the Bronco product, the argument is that under the first sale doctrine, it generally loses control over how that product is resold. And so Vintage Modern claims in their answer to the complaint that Ford filed that since they purchased the original Ford Bronco from Ford and for purposes of refurbing it, they have the right to restore and resell them on the market, even if they reference the original manufacturer, which is Ford. So they're trying to differentiate the two marks. They're also trying to come back and defend against Ford's claims with some trademark doctrine. And so, it's a really interesting case. But Nick, I want to talk about one defense that Vintage Modern is using that I think is really, really key in terms of a takeaway for folks who are listening. And that is that Vintage Modern is arguing Ford abandoned certain trademarks by discontinuing the Bronco line from 1966 to 2020, which I think is interesting.
Now, I know Ford didn't sell the Bronco from there, right?
Right.
But there was still substantial, you still see Broncos from the 60s running around today. Is that something where someone who owned one of those first through fourth gen Broncos reselling it, does that keep Ford's name in the market? Does that keep their claim?
Arguably, yes. If Ford was, active and proactive about maintaining the mark in the marketplace, not necessarily through direct resale, but through promoting resale or promoting other products in the market that had the Bronco logo affixed to it. For example, decals, Bronco decals, stickers, Bronco t-shirts, Bronco cups, Bronco keychains, what have you. By putting those things in the market between the period of what Vintage Modern is alleging is the period of abandonment, that could be an argument Ford comes back with saying, hey, we were actively selling other products with the Bronco logo affixed to them. So.
Yeah, I think I probably had a Bronco Hot Wheels as a kid.
Yes.
And now I know the timing here is very important, as for pretty much every lawsuit.
Right.
Where Ford came out with their announcement. They announced the Bronco that was coming back in 2017.
Right.
And then it wasn't until 2 years later, now that Vintage Broncos came out and started doing it. Mm-hmm. Even if Ford had abandoned their mark, wouldn't they have kind of reestablished themselves in the market in 2017 with that announcement?
Arguably, yes. I think that's a strong claim that Ford can make, is we had preparations and plans, and we made it known through our advertising and our marketing that we were going to bring the Bronco back, so to speak. So timing is crucial here, and the court is certainly going to look at timing when evaluating the claims in this case. And it's very interesting to see the defenses that Vintage Modern is asserting, as well as the claims that Ford is bringing.
Yeah, and one thing that I kind of actually want to circle back on is you had brought up the first sale doctrine.
Right.
And how that's obviously, it's a very powerful part of the law.
Yes.
And it generally will allow the consumers to sell and resell as they please. Now, are there various forms of protection companies and sellers can use to protect themselves, right? I know Ford actually, with the Ford GT for a while there, they were making you sign a contract when you bought one that you were not allowed to resell it for 2 years.
Yeah.
And I believe it's the Oscars, where if you win an Oscar, there's a
Right.
they have the Academy has the right to repurchase it for $1, right?
Yeah.
So there does seem to be that even with the first sale doctrine, there are practical things companies can do
Yes.
to restrict the unwanted use in the market.
Absolutely. I completely agree with all of that. And it's important to keep in mind for folks listening who are either entrepreneurs or small business owners who have a business idea similar to that of Vintage Modern. It's, I think, important to note that Vintage Modern's business model is to refurb and resell these vehicles for $250K a pop. And for those who don't know, I'm sure you're well aware, the Ford Bronco is typically sold anywhere between $40K to $90K, depending on the model, the year, the extra stuff you get with your vehicle, et cetera. So, it's interesting to see a business like Vintage Modern take an idea and sell it for a lot of money. And I think if I was a betting woman, I would venture to say that's probably one of the main drivers for Ford pursuing Vintage Modern, right, is because they want those profits, that $250K per vehicle from Vintage Modern. They want back pay, they want disgorgement of those profits, and if they are successful in this lawsuit, that is ultimately, I think, what the court will ultimately do. Is if they win, they'll have to Vintage Modern will have to pay Ford back those profits.
And I think one of the most interesting things about this case is just kind of the history of Ford,
right?
Where one of their most iconic cars right now, and has been for the last 60 years, has been the Mustang, right?
Absolutely.
And specifically the Shelby Mustang, where my understanding is the Shelby Mustang was made originally not by Ford, but by Shelby American, a car company that had licensed with Ford to create a new and improved, more performance-based model.
Yeah.
Where here, my understanding is Vintage Broncos did approach Ford for some form of cooperating agreement. They wanted the wholesale rate and things like that.
Right.
And Ford rejected that.
Right.
Does that escalate the scope of damages we're talking about here?
I think it does, because Ford can argue, hey, we had a discussion about a licensing agreement here. We ultimately did not go through with it for a variety of reasons, and they knew the risk going into this because they didn't enter into that licensing arrangement. So this infringement, this alleged infringement, is willful, it's wanton, and they did it knowingly.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something that if Ford, argues that at trial, if this case goes to trial, then that's definitely going to weaken Vintage Modern's case.
And now, so kind of just tying this all together for what the audience can take away from this. I think one of the most important aspects of this and running a business, especially if a business is going to be around for decades, is that the consumer market shifts.
It shifts, absolutely.
And any good business has to adapt to those shifts.
Yes.
And here we had Ford, where the Bronco was the first SUV, right? It was their pride and joy for decades.
Right.
And then it stopped selling well. Oil prices went up. And then they kind of abandoned it for 3 decades.
Yeah.
But they still had the foresight to go out there and continue to use the Bronco name and trademark in the market. They had the shirts, they had the toys, they did the keychains, all of those. And now that the consumer market has shifted back to things that are retro are cool again, they're able to come out here and capitalize.
Absolutely. And what you mentioned about abandonment and still putting things out there and protecting your mark and protecting your brand in that way, I think, is super crucial. If you are a business owner or an entrepreneur with a brand or a logo that you're working on or that you're kind of wanting to put on the back shelf for a bit, talking to a trademark lawyer about ways you can continue to protect that mark and continue to use it, something in the trademark world that's called continued use, making sure that you're being proactive about protecting your trademark rights is, I think, a great investment and a good use of time for business owners, because you eliminate that risk of abandonment, which means if your mark is abandoned, you lose your trademark rights. If your mark is abandoned on the USPTO, you lose those federal rights. If your mark is abandoned through common law rights, you lose those geographic rights that you get under common law. So it's a very big takeaway, and it's an extremely important as business owners take into consideration how to protect their intellectual property.
And so what's next in this?
So as this legal battle unfolds, the court will determine whether Vintage Modern's branding constitutes trademark infringement or if it's within Vintage Modern rights to do what they're doing. A ruling in favor of Ford in this case could totally impact the classic car restoration industry as well as just the resale industry writ large. And it would set a precedent for how trademarks are applied to restored vehicles. And so it's really going to be an interesting development. And conversely, if a decision comes out favoring Vintage Modern, it could really challenge how big companies like Ford and other manufacturers enforce their trademarks against small businesses. So if this case goes to trial, we can expect to see extensive expert testimony, including trademark law specialist reports, automotive industry analysts coming in to the court, and it's going to be really interesting to see unfold.
I think this is definitely something we're going to have to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, thank you for joining us for BL Business Branding.